Hello in-person and virtual audience. Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here for tonight's event. We are celebrating the release of The White Horse with Erika T. Wurth and Jenn Givhan. Hello! So Erika is an urban native of Apache, Chickasaw, and Cherokee descent, whose work has appeared in numerous journals such as BuzzFeed and The Kenyon Review. White Horse is her debut novel and is also an ND Next pick. Yay! And of course, in conversation, we have Jenn, who not only had an event with us as well for her latest novel, River Woman, River Demon, but she's also an Mexican-American and indigenous poet and transformational coach. If you have any questions you would like to ask the authors later in the event, we'll be having an audience Q&A, but before that, we'll be having conversation and questions between the two. Afterward, we'll be doing an in-store signing. For everyone joining us virtually, if you would like to still get a personalized book from either one of these two authors, you can give us a call, so make sure to get those personalizations. Otherwise, you can get signed books. All right, thank you so much.
Yeah. I'm going to stand and read because it feels weird to sit and read. I don't know why. I don't have those answers. I just want to thank you so much for attending physically and or virtually. And I want to thank the organizers of this particular reading because, I've organized readings and it is a pain in the arse at times, but it's, it's a fabulous thing to do. And this is a fabulous bookstore. And I especially want to thank Jenn because Jenn and I wrote these sort of sister twin books in a sense. And, I just love Jenn's work. And I came across it a couple of years ago when I was reviewing actually for a trade magazine. And I was like, oh, I love this work. And I'd already known about her, but I was like, oh my gosh, she's so fabulous. So. Yeah. And so, it actually isn't my debut novel. I've published in what I like to call literary realism. What's Cassandra? Yay! Hey. I published in literary realism. I published some poetry back in the day. But eventually, I kind of wanted to go back to my nerd roots. And I started reading elf books again and spaceship books again and ghost books again. And I decided, you know what, I'm gonna write this horror novel. I'm gonna go back to my darker nerd roots. And so that is how White Horse came about. The short log line is it's an indigenous literary horror novel, but the longer one is it's about a woman named Carrie who loves heavy metal and loves horror, but despises the mother she thinks abandoned her when she was 2 days old. Until her sister or her cousin, who's super well-intentioned girl named Debbie, and she finds this ancient bracelet of her mother's. And the minute the main character touches it, her mother's ghost starts haunting her, and this evil Bigfoot character starts invading her dreams. And the main character decides, you know what, maybe I have to find out what happened to my mother after all. So I'm going to read a very, very short passage, and then Jenn's going to read, and then we're just going to, talk, and then we'd love to hear your questions. There was something strange, mysterious even, about the White Horse tonight. Normally, it was merely an Indian bar, my Indian bar, but there was a milky, dreamy quality to the red light swinging over the pool tables, like the wind from the open doors was bringing them something new, something I'd pushed away for as long as I could remember. Debbie, do we have to talk about her again? I took another swig of my beer and slammed it back down, eyeing my cousin as I did. She would never let this subject go, no matter how much I rebuffed her. I sighed, taking in the dank, wet wood smell of the bar, the harsh laughter of the bikers in the booth behind me. The thing is, I interrupted her with a brush of my hand. I hoped Nick, the bartender, would come by and ask if I needed a refill, but all I could see was the mirror in front of me, the words Miller High Life emblazoned in gold cursive on the front. Right next to it, a sign read, First Fight, Last Drink, Permanent 86. Besides us, the bartender and the bikers, the White Horse was empty. It was always empty, but I loved it. I loved the long wooden bar, the cats wandering in and out. The mangy orange one was my favorite. She liked to sit on top of the bar and let me pet her while she closed her cloudy eyes and purred. Debbie shifted her weight on the stool, the plastic crackling as she did, the bar stirring around me like a bad dream. All I'm saying is that you don't know your mom's story. Yeah, okay, Debbie, that's great, I said. I signaled Nick when he came out of the bathroom. 2 more, I said, hoping he'd remember. A couple of Danae came through the doors, quiet the way they were, and made their way to a pool table in the back. One of them saw me when he came over to order a beer, and he gave me the friendly nod, his black hair glistening red in the faint bar light. I nodded back, and that strange feeling I'd had earlier flooded back into me. The thing is, Debbie said, you know how we check in on your dad? I hung my head. Yeah, so I went over there the other day to do that and some cleaning because I know the nurse is great and everything, but I'd like to see how he is. And I just come home from work. I was dropping the kids off. Jesus, Debbie, if you're not going to let it go, spit it out. Okay, she said, starting again. So Mom had been pushing me to clear some of the boxes in the attic, and we were going to haul them out and throw them in the dumpster, but Mom seemed to want to look through them. And mainly they were full of old toys and papers and rusting appliances. But then we found something. What? I whispered, and that dreamy quality snapped back. Something of your mom's. I was silent. My mother, the woman who had abandoned me when I was only 2 days old. The woman who my father had been so devastated over he began to take long drives, a bottle of Jack in between his legs. The woman who had made it so that I had to care for my dad like a baby, instead of the other way around, after he got into an accident that had left his body and taken his mind. Cecilia.
I'm so excited to be here. I love Erika's novel, devoured it, and so excited to be here to read with you and chat with you and all of you. Thank you for being here. And it was so funny when I was reading your book and I was like, how did we not just sit down and have a conversation about what our books were going to be about? It's uncanny how many parallels there are between our work. So I'm so grateful for you. So I'm just going to read a few pages from the first chapter of River Woman, River Demon, October 18th. It isn't the first time I hear a woman howling from the water. The river that flows alongside my property keeps me close to karma, even as it reminds me of my apple-cheeked friend who drowned when we were 15-year-olds in the girl-dumb, woman-lost space where karma got caught, where she ghosts the borderlands between almost woman and never. In my Mexica culture, a woman forever yowls beside a ditch bank, or a girl, depending on which story you believe. She's supposed to be a mother, but in some versions, she never grows beyond round-breasted girlhood. She bears the body for mothering, but drowns before she's given the chance. The water laps the sides of the tub, jarring me back. I flip the faucet off with my toes and recline deeper, staring out the window at the waxing moon. A sliver of candlelight against the glass sends a shadowing across my center, where it aches. I hold my breath and lower my head into the bathwater, eyes wide, suds filming across my eyeballs as I attempt again to view the world the way she saw it in the end. Each time I plunge myself beneath the surface, karma appears. Girl I loved most in the world. Girl they say I drowned. Nothing comes we haven't conjured or called one way or another. I blinked the spume away, staring at the bloated moon above, its face as round as last I saw karma's. The alcohol sopping my memory doesn't help. Vodka tonight. It sloshes at the edges so I can't remember when I went from my hot shop, where I must have spent hours, the furnace running, unable to create anything worthwhile, just imperfect glass for the junk pile, to the tub. Nor can I recall why I chose the bathwater over the warmth of my bed and Jericho's body, or why the water beckons, perpetually calls me under. When I shut my eyes again, the moon disappears. How long did karma hold her breath? I wonder every time as I hold my own, before she too vanished from this world. An Oxbow Lake still waters. It begins as a meander from a river offshoot, then if the earth were a body, and of course the earth is a body, where the limb breaks, the blood water pools, and it pools past the wrists into the palm of the land, where it lingers, horseshoe or half moon, a crescent lake, a scythe. We swam there, Karma and I, in the frog pond that belonged to Sammy's uncle out past the fields of alfalfa, onions, and honeydew, beyond the river that slews across the border, frothing and foaming as it rolls from Mexicali to Calexico, like sisters sprung from different families, like Karma and I, as close as friends could get, before one of them drowns the other. It was toxic. That water, that night, every subsequent night corroded by the swamp of memory. We three friends under the cover of mesquite and moonshine, only the weak beams of a porch light streaming across the backyard. Inside his uncle's house, Sammy's older brother Dom must have been watching television. I can still see the faint blue haze of the screen through the undraped windows. But it's the image of the three of us that crystallizes, the moments before we step into the water. Karma in the clearing, her body and mine rounded in similar ways, making us both appear much older than we were. And our faces round too, in the way of girls still emerging from pubescence. Beside us, Sammy is string-beaned in length, tall enough to be a man, but so thin he's more like the outline of a man. We slide in deeper to the dark body until we're up to our necks and treading, unbothered by the grunge and slick of river weeds and mossy plants floating upward like witch's hair. Sammy swims closer to us, splashing playfully. We're laughing and splashing back, the water cool from the nighttime, but not so cold we can't catch our breaths. Between our gulping laughter and the sloshing of a broken river lake, if Karma speaks, her words are only a mirage, a manifestation of my longing to hear her voice again. Desire compels me to fabricate what I can't remember. She might have joked about our breasts floating on the surface of the water, or warned of leeches clasping our slick skin, to which Sammy might have rejoined that only frogs populated this pond, perhaps catfish or carp. Certainly not leeches. Karma might have said she was thirsty, or had I asked for something to drink? Who sent Sammy inside for Cokes? We watch, giggling as Sammy scampers, giraffe-legged and bare-assed as a newborn, toward his uncle's, slamming the door behind him. I'd like to believe Karma whispered, "I love you, Eva," before she dove to the murky depths. Instead, I remember the horseplay, the pushing each other harder and holding each other longer under the water until we shove each other in the ribs or kick each other's knees or burst through the surface coughing and spluttering, our bodies pressed together, at first maybe in annoyance or mock anger, and then in something stickier, something that pooled inside me when we grabbed hands to run through the alleyways toward the donut shop or fell to my bed laughing. In the shadows, her blonde hair, soaked and matted to her face and neck, nearly matched the onyx of my own. Her blue eyes grayed. Her breath smelled faintly of pepperoni and Dr. Pepper. And as she pulls away from me toward the swampy bottom, before she disappears, I shake and shake the memory, but it will not tell. Was I grasping for her fingers as she slipped downward out of my reach? Or was I pushing her under?
I have this condition that I eat. I have to cough like 50 times. Like, man. I don't know. I think both of us were kind of talking a little bit about guilt. Someone the other day was telling me, there's a lot of guilt in your novel. And I thought, it's really interesting, because I guess I hadn't seen that. And it's guilt in both of our cases around a childhood friend. I think I'm still puzzling that one out in terms of how it fits in with the themes of the novel. But how would you say it fits in with the overall archer theme of your novel?
Yeah, I was thinking about that too, because both of our novels are blur genre. Yeah. For sure. Yeah. And so someone had asked me how was mine a thriller, and I was thinking about obsession and guilt, right? And how actually it's very literary, and both of ours fall into horror. But I think that the obsession and the guilt around a certain incident, and this one is the death of her friend, and in yours the death of Carrie's best friend as well. And I mean, I think it's very clear that in mine, the protagonist, Eva, believes that she has killed her friend, and I think that hints at the issues of the gaslighting that are happening to her on a cultural and on a larger level, that she's been deprived of her roots, right? So she's a bruja, she's a witch, but she's been deprived of that cultural connection. And I feel like that's very similar to Carrie in some ways, that she's been denied crucial information about her mother and herself.
Yeah. I think, it's funny because there's this, I'm still kind of new to the world of horror, right? And so the podcast that I like the best, it's a British dude, and it's called Talking Scared. And I was like, oh man, I really want to be on it. And I was listening to it, and I realized at one point, like, he's nice about it. but if he doesn't like a book, he'll say it. He'll be like, although I felt that he was a nice fella, I did feel that his book felt paltry, and I wanted to throw it into a bank of hot magma. I'm like, oh my God. So, so I was on it the other day, and I was ridiculously nervous, Yeah, he was saying something to the effect of she's been deprived her culture. And I was like, I think she knows culturally who she is. She's an urban Indian. She's surrounded with other urban Indians of, Mexican Indian descent and Black descent and, Chickasaw descent, et cetera, et cetera. Although, like me, right, she grew up in Idaho Springs. And so we're talking about a lot of Lakota and Dene, really, But what she doesn't have any interest in is her spirituality, like Native spirituality. And it's mainly because, it's set in 2016 and she's just a Gen Xer and she's very pragmatic and she just doesn't see the interest or use in it. So Auntie Squeaker is like, oh, I have this cure for like warts, or I have this cure, or I have this, if you're depressed, I can help you, if you need to be pregnant, if you don't want to be pregnant, right? So she loves Auntie Squeaker and she hangs out with her, but she's not interested in that at all. And so I think what happens in the novel is she is finally allowed a way through understanding what really happened to her mom and who her mom was, in having a sort of non-cheesy way to have access to her spirituality. Because, she's just very earthy, pragmatic, kind of an asshole kind of personality, although lovable.
She's very lovable.
So I think that's, for me, that's kind of what I was thinking a lot about when it comes to like what was she deprived of. So.
Yeah. And do you think guilt factors into that?
I think for her, it's more... I think she unburies this feeling that I should have done more when it came to my best friend. That's where I think the guilt comes in. I think that with her father, she has to face that her father made some decisions, as much as she mythologizes him, that were not so great, that were not so smart, and that led to some of the things that impacted her. So, yeah. I love all the magic in your book, though, because, the language is really magical. And you've also I assume it's La Llorena, right? That you're talking about at times. That was my big question. This is La Llorena, right?
Yeah. So, I'm obsessed with La Llorona and yeah, that's fine. And she appears in pretty much everything that I write. And so the water just keeps coming back. And I realized too, I'm writing about the Salton Sea in my next book. And so I'm like, I can't get away from the water. It just keeps coming back. Do you have topics like that are just obsessive for you? And
yes.
How did they appear in White Horse?
That's funny because you're Pueblo descent. So it's like, you're actually kind of landlocked. Yeah. It must be the California thing.
And I think that's what it is about the water, though, is that I grew up in the desert and that it's like water is everything. And especially I grew up in the Imperial Valley. And so we had to bring water in from the Colorado River. And I was telling you earlier tonight that you thought that it was dry heat where I grew up. And it was actually very humid. And it was kind of like they had made their own climate with the irrigation. And so it's this sense of being in the desert. And so if you don't have water, you die. You don't have anything and all the crops die and everything down there in the Imperial Valley. And so, and then also I grew up near canals. And so, we were always being told, don't swim in the canals. And then my best friend actually died. She drowned in a canal, she and her brother, when we were teenagers. And I think that played a major role too in the death in River Woman, River Demon. So I think that it became something I was obsessed with, and it keeps playing out in my novels, which I didn't even know was horror. People would tell me, these books are so scary. I started with Trinity Sight and then with River Woman, that, this is terrifying. And then I was being compared to Stephen King, and you've been compared to Stephen King. And I was like, I didn't even know, but now, okay, it makes sense because these are real traumas that I'm dealing with. And I feel like I wanted to know how that appeared in your book as well.
I think a lot about, I'm kind of a nerd when it comes to genres, right? So if you do the MFA or you do the PhD in creative writing literature, as we talked about, sometimes people bandy about these terms like literary, and what they mean is either postmodern or realism, right? And they'll be like, oh, genre, as if that defines anything, right? So as somebody who thinks a lot about this and writes articles about it, I started to become really annoyed with the idea of genre and literary, which makes zero sense. It is realism, and postmodernism is a form, right? You can write in that affects the form. And otherwise you have romance and horror and things like this. And so I think for me, what I realized was literary is a series of conventions, right? It's depth of theme, attention to form and language, and complex characterization. And so I thought, if I like all these nerdy things, I can do the nerd things, but still do those things. And so I can still draw from my literary background. And so I feel like that's what I was doing. And I think for me, I was obsessed with horror when I was a kid. I was deeply obsessed. The other question you ask yourself, right, when you're talking about what am I writing, is you're asking yourself, well, what is the plot pointed towards? Well, the plot in your case, and actually in mine, is pointed towards a crime. So in many ways, the answer is, what kind of book is it? It's a thriller or it's a crime book. Right. And in some ways, speculative literature, horror, science fiction, fantasy, it's setting. It's the suspension of rules, right? This other world is kind of descending and invading. And the question I wanted to ask you, I have to go back to La Llorona, is the other night I had my reading for White Horse. It was like one of my first ones in Denver, the Tatter cover. And I had a bunch of people used to go to the White Horse, and people whose dads owned the White Horse, which is a real bar in Denver. It's the Indian bar in Denver, and it just closed. It's so sad. And they were telling crazy stories. They were talking about how there were skinwalkers on the roof of the bar. And I thought, whoa. And like the cops were shooting at them and they were just disappearing. And so skinwalkers is something, right, they talk about different reservations. But I thought wherever we are, our world comes with us, right? So that's why I wanted to ask about La Llorona is where is her origin point? And would you say she's transportable culturally? Like she will appear where her people are, I guess, Oh,
that's such a good question. So I learned about her where I grew up in the Imperial Valley, and I know that she's prominent in a lot of Latin American cultures. I'm Mexican American, and so that's the story that I grew up with. I love what you're saying though about that we take it's almost like we take the ghosts with us, right? We carry them with us. And I was thinking about what you were saying too right now about the two worlds, or the worlds that we create through science fiction, fantasy, horror, and the White Horse. And I wanted to know a little bit more about like your sense of creating the reality that you grew up in, like your town, and then how do you also because there is a very, very much another world in your book, right? And there are two, and actually I'm not going to give any plot away. You have to read the book. It's so good. But there's a time that these two worlds, right, are very clearly connected. And I was kind of getting a Stranger Things vibe there too, which I loved. But I wanted to know about how did you go about building a very realistic world as well as a spirit world?
I'm a huge, like I said, I love Grossman's magicians. I love, and K. Jemison, and I love, which is, science fiction, fantasy, and I love, gosh, you name it. Like I love all the things really. Hyperion, I love Dan Simmons' Hyperion, and even though he's got apparently a bad man, and you don't want to know what he has to say on the internet, and so I love especially science fiction and fantasy because, right, you can set it on another world, you can have this dystopia, or you can have utopia, or kind of a mix of both. I love fantasy because it's like this is potentially a completely, again, another world, maybe a world that existed in pre-Columbian times, or a world that might have existed. And I love all that stuff. But what I love about horror was, I think it's, depending on how you do it, there's a way in which you can take realism and all the gritty elements of my work that existed before, and then I could crash them into the nerd things. And so, yeah, that was hard. And what was especially hard, and what I liked about it, again, was like being able to talk about these darker things, but in a more like overt way. I always feel like it's funny with literary people. It's like, if it's literary, the ghost isn't real. And I'm like, what does that have to do with depth of theme? Like, what is that? No. That's supposedly the line. But it was hard, and I wanted to, create fear on the page. It's sort of like being a poet and being funny. It's hard. It's really hard. And so I really had to ask myself, like, what scares me? What really actually fundamentally compels me? And what scares me. And I feel like that's how I was able to thread this realistic world into something that was more surrealistic and more fearful and more bits and pieces that were portals to other worlds. So.
Yeah, and I love how you do that, and that everything, like all of the spirit elements and all of the fear elements, right, are connected very much to either like the murdered and missing indigenous women, right? And very real things that happen to women, especially, and particularly Native women. And then, for instance, there was a scene where Carrie is having, well, a couple of scenes where Carrie is having a face-off with her cousin's boyfriend, Jack. So her cousin Debbie's boyfriend, Jack. And I was very tangibly like shaking for her and for everyone, for her cousin and for the kids and because you were showing, right? So I love that there was not only the horror of the monsters, right? But the monstrous within, right? People, ordinary people and ordinary actions. And I thought that was brilliant.
I think, thank you. And I think that's hard. And I guess I would ask you, that's one of the questions I'd ask you too. Like, I want it all, right? I want it all. I want to have things have that extra layer of meaning without losing the cool, it's truly a ghost and I'm scared quality, right?
Yes.
And for example, I love the Conjuring series. I cannot watch those movies enough. Like, and it's funny because my boyfriend's a thriller writer. And so yet he's totally terrified by horror and he can't stand it. And he'll be like, what are you watching? I'm like, a good show. And he'll be like, I can't watch that. And I'm like, you just watched murdering, but apparently he's paranormal murdering.
Like,
not okay.
As soon as the supernatural comes in.
It's over, And so, but yeah, I wanted to have both because I feel like that's kind of what I found disappointing in stuff that was magical realism. I was like, oh, and the ghost isn't real. Now I'm, or the ghost is actually representative in a generation trauma. And I'm like, no, I want it to be real. And so in the end, like I tried to make both happen. So I would say, how did you balance those things too? Like how were you able to be like, no, in some ways this is real, but it also represents something else, and I'm keeping both of these things?
Oh yeah, it's definitely real. Like the ghosts are definitely real in River Woman, River Demon. And so I take a cue from, for instance, Toni Morrison's Beloved, which I read when I was 16, and then Ana Castillo's So Far From God.
Yeah.
And so, for instance, like it is representative as well. It is a metaphor as well of the social injustice that's happening, and especially violence against women and women of color. But also, right, so when the women jump off the cliff in So Far From God, on one level, yes, they do die. But on the other level, they become, right, this myth, and they live forever. And then in Beloved, like on one hand, maybe she is just a woman. On the other hand, she is a ghost and she is the baby. And like you never have certain closure, right? And it doesn't matter. It's both. And so I think that's how I work to achieve having it all in River Woman, River Demon, and that, and also it is just magical real in a sense. So I don't see magical realism as the ghost is not real.
Right.
I think that there's dream world and magic, and they are real. Like, so another one of my influences is Laura Esquivel's Like Water for Chocolate.
Oh, yeah.
And it's just magic is very real. And I loved that. So even though I wasn't intentionally setting out to write horror and I didn't necessarily know all of the horror tropes, I just knew, what haunts me and what I had to get out onto the page. But one of the things that I loved, and as I realized, okay, this is horror, and I started tapping into that more, is that in horror, right, things can be sort of unresolved like that. And you don't need to pin it down because the spirit world doesn't pin it down, right? And I loved that I could tap into that in my novel. What about you?
I am completely compelled by a genre that Americans allow for there to be an unhappy ending, and want more of it, because Americans like pretty much want the happy ending. And I even actually kind of did that for the first time. I'm like, weird, maybe because I'm doing horror, I can allow myself to, right? But
it was earned.
Yeah, that's what
yeah. It was totally earned.
But I am fascinated. Like I am a child, right, of the 70s and 80s, and so I watch, Freddy Krueger. And Freddy Krueger, like at the end, what's so great, it's so ridiculous. I rewatched them the other day. I'm like, these are great, and they're awful, and they're great. And I love how my influences are like Nightmare on Elm Street. God. I'm like, and Beloved, and but yeah, and he at the end of every single one, it seems happy, but then it's not. And then Americans want more. And I'm like, that's so interesting. And I think I wanted that permission, So, yeah.
Yeah.
You just get more. You get more space in horror.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. Do we have some
Let's see,
audience
yeah, we might have
questions?
some.
Yeah. Audience questions.
Yeah. It's always people are like, oh.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah, I read, all of the, R.L. Stein's, and I read, I think Goosebumps was after my time.
I was going to say, I was horror light Goosebumps.
And I remember coming to the library and being like, I want something about a girl and a ghost.
Yeah.
And anything. But I realized, like, in the end, my tastes were getting darker because the Nancy Drews that I was reading, for example,
Yeah.
I wanted the more, and I was getting into the Gothic stuff, and I really just consumed everything. And I certainly read, the standard horror authors. But in the end, once I found Stephen King, it was like, I like my love, and I just compulsively read him. And I can't remember whether my best friend from high school introduced me to Stephen King or if just wandering the shelves in the library. But I definitely, as you can see from the book, like I was really changed by him. And I think, as so many people are. And then when I got to college, right, and then did my PhD, they ironed that out of me. Like, I was like, I want to do my thesis and on Stephen King, and my peers just laughed at me. And I, as much as I was like a tough bird, in some ways I was quite stubborn, it did get to me. It did eventually get to me. And that's why I read and wrote realism for years. And then I would let myself watch speculative things. And then I let myself watch Doctor Who again. And then I let myself read Lev Grossman. And then it was just really over. Mm-hmm. And then it was just like what I started reading was mainly science fiction, fantasy. And then finally I think what happened was that was the last genre, I was like not letting myself read. And then once I read it, that was 80% of what I was reading. And then I started writing it, so.
Yeah, that's so interesting too, that it was, and it makes me sad that it was like, laughed out of you essentially for however long, because I feel like it's really coming back now and like blurring all of the genres. And I feel like at some point maybe we won't even have that, because why, right? Why do we have to stick to a specific category or go, right into a certain box? And I mean, I understand that some people enjoy, and that's fine, but I don't think that we need to concern ourselves with that as writers. Like, I certainly don't sit down and say, I'm going to write and then like one genre, right? I have a story to tell, and I want as many like creative tools at my disposal to be able to tell that story. So
I would say I have become a little compulsive now. I do want to read horror like really badly all the time. And I was watching horror the whole way through. But the scholar in me is like, no, it should be a thing and you should label it. But I do in the end think you're essentially right, because the problem is with labeling, eventually people are angry if you're not in the box. Yeah. And so that does make a lot of sense. But I think you had another question for Jenn.
Oh, just my influences. But I mean, when I was younger, I was, like I said, Goosebumps. I read some B.C. Andrews.
Oh, yeah. Oh, God.
And actually, I read a lot of my mom's books. And my mom was reading a lot of things like, my mom was very religious. She's Catholic, but she was also, Protestant a little bit as well. But so I remember reading this series called This Present Darkness, which I believe is a religious like series, but it's all about demons. Like demon hunting, basically, essentially. And so, like, it was terrifying. And then she read a lot of thrillers. So, like, and I mean, I was young. I was like 10, 11, 12, and reading, like Mary Higgins Clark about, I think it was like All Around the Town or something. It was a multiple personalities, split personalities. And so like some terrifying things actually. And I think you'll see that actually shows up quite a bit in River Woman, River Demon, although most of my influences now are lean literary and magical real. But some of the horror that I've loved recently, Mexican Gothic was wonderful. Yeah. Right. And so that's kind of how I've been like telling people it's like Mexican Gothic. And so I feel like it's happening now, right? Like the genres are beginning to blur, and I'm so grateful for for that, because I feel like there's a place now where there wasn't before. And it's like, I didn't know where to shelve my books before. So like Trinity Sight was in sci-fi fantasy, but like sci-fi people were like, this isn't really sci-fi. And I'm like, it's not, right? It's magical realism with this horror slant. I don't know, and then Jubilee and now this, but now it's like, okay, what do I write? Badass women dealing with really scary things.
Yeah.
Like, that's what I write.
You're right, though. There is a hell of a renaissance going on. And I know horror writers are almost like Sylvia Moreno Garcia has almost become Stephen King. They're like, yeah, Mexican Gothic. But it's so great. And the main character is this like saucy, noirish woman who is in Mexico City in the 50s and is like kind of a party animal. And she's indigenous. And it's part of how she defeats the bad guy who's a mushroom. How did that? I love that book was on the bestseller list for like 7 months. It's just such a random, And then there's Grady Hendrix, who's just a genius. Stephen Graham Jones, my indigenous brother from another mother, V. Castro, she's a Mexican indigenous writer who's great. Cynthia Pelayo. There's so many horror writers, and they're all, you're right, they're across the board. And some, like Cynthia Pelayo, is very crimey commercial, but horror, and you're like literary, very horror. And so I love that. I love that it's all across the board.
I keep meaning to ask you, you've mentioned Carrie a couple of times, and I just loved her so much. But you said, she was kind of an asshole at times, and I love that. So, and one thing that I keep hearing is this thing about likable versus unlikable women, and that's kind of become like a little side obsession of mine now. And I want a panel about it, and I think there's a book coming out next year called Unlikable Women that I'm excited to read. But I wanted to know, what was your experience, or what has been your experience with that idea of like, what is a likable or unlikable woman, and how was that on your mind at all when you were creating Carrie?
That is a good question. I think that the women I grew up with were a bit astride the norm, in the sense that it was this tiny little town outside of Denver. I grew up in the mountains and I went to school there. And it was majority working class white, although middle classness was threaded throughout. My parents were kind of poor growing up. They tried to make a middle class existence for me, but my dad liked to blow our money. So it was kind of working class, large chunk of indigenous people of, again, Mexican Indian and North American Indian heritage. I'm kind of both. And there was something, they were kind of tough girls, and they were kind of likable, and they were funny, and they were fucking mean.
Yeah.
And I was really dorky, and they were always like, you're worthless. And I was like, I'm going to die. Like, I was in a constant state of like, oh, what's going to happen? Who's going to punch my face next? But they, in their way, they were kind of doing me a kindness. They were like trying to toughen me up, because they knew that like the world wasn't to be nice to me. But in the end, like what I liked about them, and I think what's interesting about this character, is that she's kind of a macho shithead, but she doesn't loot. Like, she still likes to hang out with women, right?
Yeah.
And
she's supportive of women.
Yeah, very much.
Like, loyal.
And I felt like that was a thing, a value system where I grew up. So I think that was kind of all the combination of weird things that probably work for Carrie, So I don't know if this is.
I kept thinking that she reminded, and I loved, like I said, I got Stranger Things vibes, and I love Stranger Things. And that's another one that really blurs all the lines, right? And is all the genres. But Eddie in Stranger Things.
Oh, I love that. Yes. I love Eddie. They're all great. It's a great show.
Oh, and I wanted to ask about your the metal influence, right? Carrie loves metal. So
similar, right? It's a soundtrack to my childhood, because I grew up in the 80s and 90s, and I was an indie rock and hip hop kid, but I came back around to metal because it was everywhere. Plus, I just loved Dave Mustaine, and I finally admitted it to myself. And then I went to go see Megadeth the other day, and they were like fucking great. And then I gave someone a copy who was security. And I was like, I know you probably can't get it to him, but just try. So, anyway, I think someone else had yeah. Yeah. I think ask yourself, it doesn't have to be autobiography, but for example, I'm of Chickasaw descent, and the monster in the novel is the Lofa. And that's a, kind of an evil Bigfoot, and he likes to skin you and eat the skin. And he's such a scary bad guy, right? And I don't think that, and I also have Geronimo, sort of a flashback in there. And, I just have ghosts because I like ghosts because they're cool. But I think ask yourself what you love, where you come from, what's unique about it. It doesn't matter if it's a suburb of, somewhere in Indiana. If you really draw from the mythologies that you come from and the landscape that you come from, I think that you can create something really new.
Yeah, I agree. And I would say that in my own, for instance, in River Woman, River Demon, I knew that I wanted to write about brujeria, which is a kind of a witchcraft. But if I say that I'm a bruja, for instance, to other like Latinx folks, right, there can be this sense of like, because of colonization, right? So being a bruja versus a curandera is like the bruja has like, sorry, I'm struggling to say this word, malevolent intent. And it's like, usually in mainstream culture, so in this novel, Eva is married to a professor of hoodoo. And so I'm writing about all kinds of folk magic here, hoodoo and brujeria. And then there's also a woman who practices Wiccan. And in the mainstream, though, this has been seen as negative, right? And it's like usually they're like the sorceresses, they're the source of evil or whatever. And I wanted to show how in my biracial family, and bicultural family, the folk magic is the source of power and strength, and it's a protective spell. And so I feel like what you're saying about taking from your, like drawing from your own culture and your own mythologies, right, and then giving it a spin. And so, and then on the other hand, also I wanted to write something that was a thriller as well, and so I call it my Chicana girl on the train. And so you'll see that it follows, like, you know, it follows that kind of path of the girl on the train. But I had never seen, and this is changing quite a bit now, but several years back when I was dealing with postpartum depression and I was reading these thrillers and they had like very dark women, like who were dealing with darkness, right, in them. And it was like a medicine to my soul. And so I wanted to write my own, but I wasn't seeing women of color. And it was mostly like wealthy white women. And it was, and so I wanted to see myself. And I think that that's another way that we can like write ourselves into the genre, write ourselves into the story.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Sandra.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like each book is like each novel. So I started out writing poetry, and I feel like language is at the core of what I write, and where in the story, it's like I usually see it first in this kind of like haze, right? And it's in this world of like lyricism, and that's where I see it. But I know that some has to come out as a story. And so Erika, you and I were talking about how we come from a more literary tradition. And so I had to teach myself how to write plot and what that meant. And I bought so many books on craft, and I had to learn how to do it. And my first novel, the first novel I wrote was JUBILEE, and it was a mess. It was all over the place. And it took about 10 years to write that book, like to rewrite that book. Whereas then the next two books came out basically whole, because I had spent so much time teaching myself through the process of rewriting that book and learning, how to write, like what pacing is and all of that, like things I had no idea about as a poet. And so the next books came out whole. And now, I've taken it even further, and I plot ahead of time. I make sure that I have a plot so that I'm not having to go back in and like rewrite it over and over. And so I think I have taught myself, basically it's kind of like pantsing versus plotting. And I think that both can work, whether you just you follow that haze and you just go with it, and that's a wonderful, exciting place to be. But it takes me forever to write a book then, if I and like a book that's ready for publication. And so now I sit down and I make myself plot it, and I give myself all kinds of room though to explore. And my plot in the end might look very different than what I started with, but at least I had the bones and it got me through the story. So
I would essentially say almost something identical. I was told, like, the only thing you hear in academia is plot's dumb. And I'm like, yeah, it's dumb. And I'm like, but I like stories,
Yeah.
And I just wanted to know what that blueprint was, and if I wanted to deviate. And there are books, like I just ordered a book that's like the five act story, And, and then there's this amazing blog. It's kind of odd. I mean, this person, if she would go to her blog, she would see like she's now had thousands of people go to it because I keep giving it to people. But it's called Ingrid's Notes. And it's a person who just did her MFA 10 years ago. And she studied with a lot of film people. And basically they would say, well, here's the Hollywood arc, but here's this arc, and here's that arc, and that. And this is this. And she has like all these alternative structure and alternative plot. And it's so helpful because there are times in which I was just trying to master the basic. And I have to, whoever can just pants, like I thought I could. I was like, yeah, pants it. That sounds about right. Because, we're all supposed to be geniuses here. No, I'm not. And I needed to have some space, some structure for my brain to go a specific way. And I think not the next one, but the one after, I want to write something that's multiple shifting point of view. But I think I wouldn't have gotten there well. I kept trying to without getting like, okay, but this is the basic Hollywood arc. You know what I mean? Hollywood arc. So,
Yeah. Yeah. I feel like I actually come up with things that are, I don't know, more illuminating or I feel more excited about when I do have some kind of a skeleton to hang it all on. Because otherwise, I don't know if it's the poet in me or I will go on and on for like 10 pages about nothing. And I look back and I'm like, what is this about? Throw it away. And so it's ironic because you would think that giving yourself a very specific structure would kind of like tie you in and make your writing like less compelling or exciting or like new insights. But I find the opposite is true.
Absolutely.
For myself.
Same. Yeah. Same.
Hi, Marianne. We love you.
Yeah, we do. I'm like, I have a good answer, but you go.
No, you go.
Okay.
I don't have an answer. You go.
It was my bad guy because literary people, right? And when you're a literature, come from literary tradition, they're like, well, everyone's really a bad guy in a way and a good guy. And they're all mixed. And that's true. But I wanted to write a bad guy without making him a Marvel superhero bad guy, right? Yeah. And I found that the more I made him less overtly on the surface bad, the more cool and surprising that the plot point that surrounded him was at the end. And it was really funny because if you've read Stephen Graham Jones, I've known him for like 20 years, right? And he's a pantser, like you can't believe he's just pantsing. And I'm just like, I can't pants anymore. I'm too tired. I'm fumbled. But he was just cute because he doesn't really understand, and and I don't mean this in any kind of derogatory, he just straight up doesn't value those things. And so, but for himself, but for other people, like who does he like to read? Grady Hendrix, he likes to read Sylvia Moreno Garcia. So he was like, man, I didn't even realize that was a bad guy. That was like, good job, I was like really flattered. Because I fooled Stephen Graham Jones.
I agree. I was going to say about your bad guy. I don't want to give any details.
I know. I did it.
There's so like, and bad guy could be either gender or gender neutral,
right? Right. Exactly.
I'm going to just, I don't know who was the hardest character for me to write, but I wanted to talk a little bit about your, about an antagonist, writing an antagonist. And for myself, because I think it is difficult. And for myself, I know that what I do is I love my antagonists. Mm-hmm. I just love them a lot. And I think that's probably all I have to say about that.
You have to have, I think someone put it to me this way, it's essentially that you have to get into their heads and see, like, from your point of view, why they would do it. Why would they, what is their logic, their emotional logic? Or otherwise you're just sort of like, they're like sticks and you're just pushing them along, so.
Right, exactly. And because if you love someone, you're going to empathize with them. You're going to see, what, at least you're going to attempt to.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Although I think my main character's cousin's husband is like kind of a douche, but I think like he's a redeemable douche.
Well, and that's what I love about your book too, is that all of your characters do have aspects of themselves that it's like, I'm so frustrated with them and so angry, but at the same time you can understand what they're doing and why and where they come from. And then they do have, like, I feel like all of your characters have an arc, which is cool.
I worked hard on that.
Yeah. Not just your protagonist, but all of them. Yeah. Maybe there's one that doesn't.
Yeah. I think that it's an adult port. That sounds not what I mean. It's okay. An adult, not in the sexy time way, portal into another world. Like, because I was a fantasy kid first. And what was I most interested in? Magical mirrors and magical portals and magical doorways away from mean people and into a magical land. And so I feel like that's what I love about horror. It feels like an adult portal into those lands, you know, because there's something you have to be gritty and mean and real. So, yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, I was going to say similar that it can be real, right? And that it's a way of blurring the lines and bringing like what that other world. And I keep thinking of Stranger Things. And that's really something that I feel like that was a metaphor for everything that I see about what is possible with writing, right? And because I feel like you, it's like, you know, I read to escape and I read to go to these other worlds. And I feel like there's a way for us to see that other world in our everyday lives and have that encounter. And that we don't have to, like, once we close the book, like the magic is still there, right? And the power is still ours. It empowers us essentially because we live in both worlds. Like we are not just of matter, we're of spirit as well. And I feel like it's just so empowering to me. That's what I love about it. I don't always believe in it, but I don't think that matters. We don't have to believe in it for it to be real.
Just go to TikTok and there are people who really convince you. It's great. Hi, Marianne.